Hi everyone, welcome back to my Herb Journal channel, and I'm going to get into now the segment of the Reading Rainstorm where I read the Goldfinch, chapter 6. Not wanting to disturb him in case he was only resting, I was quiet as I could be. Standing up, I hurt all over, and for some moments I stood looking down at him, wiping my hands on my school jacket. His blood was all over me. My hands were slick with it, and then I looked at the moonscape of Rebel, trying to orient myself and figure the best way to go. When, with difficulty, I made my way into the center of the space, or what seemed like the center of the space, I saw that one door was obscured by rags of hanging debris. I turned and began to work in the other direction. There, the lintel had fallen, dumping a pile of brick almost as tall as I was, leaving a smoky space at the top big enough to drive a car through. Laboriously, I began to climb and scramble for it over and around the chunks of concrete, but I had not gotten very far when I realized that I was going to have to go the other way. Faint traces of fires licked down the far walls of what had been the exhibition shop, spitting and sparkling down in the dim, some of it well below the level where the floor should have been. I didn't like the look of the other room. Foam tiles, stained red, the toe of a man's shoe protruding from a pile of gravel, but at least most of the material blocking the door wasn't very solid. Blundering back through, ducking some wires that sparked from the ceiling, I hoisted the bag over my shoulder and took a deep breath and plunged into the wreckage headlong. Immediately, I was choked by dust and a sharp chemical smell. Coughing, spraying, praying there was no more live wires hanging loose. I patted and groped in the dark as all sorts of loose debris began to patter and shower down my eyes. Gravel, crumbs, plaster, shreds, and chunks of God knows what. Some of the building material was light and some of it was not. And the further I worked in, the darker it got and the hotter. Every so often my door closed up unexpectedly, and in my ears was a roaring crowd noise. I wasn't sure where it was coming from. I had to squeeze through things. Sometimes I walked, sometimes I crawled, bodies in the wreckage, more sensed than seen. Disturbing soft pressure that gave under my weight, but worse than this, the smell. Burnt cloth, burnt hair and flesh, and the tang of fresh blood, copper and tin and salt. My hands were cut, and so were my knees. I ducked under things and went around things, feeling my way as I went, edging with my hips along the side of some sort of long lathe or a beam until I found myself blocked by a solid mass that felt like a wall. With difficulty, the spot was narrow. I worked around so that I could reach into the bag for a light. I wanted that keychain light at the bottom, under the picture, but my finger closed around the phone. I switched it on and almost immediately dropped it because of the glow. I caught sight of a man's hand protruding between two chunks of concrete. Even in my terror, I remember feeling grateful that it was only a hand. Although the fingers had a meaty, dark, swollen look I've ever been able to forget. Every now and then, I still start back in fear when some beggar on the street thrust out to me such a hand bloated and grimed with black around the nails. There was still the flashlight, but I wanted the phone. It cast a weak glimmer up into the cavity where I was, but just as I recovered myself, stood enough to stoop for it, the screen went dark. An acid green afterburn floated before me in the blackness. I got down on my knees and crawled around in the dark, grabbing with both hands in rocks and glass, determined to find it. I thought I knew where it was, or about where it was, and I kept looking for it, probably longer than I should have, and it was when I'd given up hope and tried to get up again that I realized I'd crawled into a low spot where it was impossible to stand. And some solid surface about 3 inches above me. Turning around didn't work. Going backwards didn't work, so I decided to crawl forwards, hoping that things would open up. And soon I found myself itching along painfully with a smashed, desperate feeling. My head turned sharply to one side. When I was about 4, I'd gotten particularly stuck inside a Murphy bed in our old apartment on 7th Avenue, which sounds like a humorous predicament, but wasn't really. I think I would have suffocated if Alameda, our housekeeper back then, hadn't heard my muffled cries and pulled me out. Trying to maneuver in that airless space was somewhat the same, only worse. With glass, hot metal, the stick of burned clothes, and occasional soft something pressing in on me that I didn't want to think about. Debris was pattering down on me heavily from above. My throat was filling with dust, and I was coughing hard and starting to panic when I realized that I could see, just barely, the rough texture of broken bricks that surrounded me. Light, the faintest gleam imaginable, crept in steadily from the left, about 6 inches from floor level. I ducked lower and found myself looking over to the dim terrazzo floor of the gallery beyond, a disorderly pile of what looked like rescue equipment, ropes, axes, crowbars, and oxygen tanks that said FDYNY lay harum-scarum on the floor. "Hello?" I called out, not waiting for an answer, dropping to wiggle through the hole as fast as I could. The space was narrow. If I'd been a few years older or a few pounds heavier, I might not have been able to get through. Part way, my bag got caught on something, and for a moment I thought I might have to slip free of it, painting or no painting, like a lizard shedding its tail. But when I gave it one last pull, it finally broke free with a shower of crumpled plaster. Above me, a beam of some sort, which looked like it was holding up a lot of heavy building materials. And as I twisted and squirmed beneath it, I was lightheaded with fear that it would slip and cut me in two until I saw that somebody had stabilized it with the jack. Once clear, I climbed to my feet, watery and stunned with relief. "Hello?" I called again, wondering why there was so much equipment around and why not a fireman in sight. The gallery was dim, but mostly undamaged, with gauzy layers of smoke that thickened the higher they rose. But you could tell that a tremendous force of some sort had blown through the room just from the lights and the security cameras, which were knocked askew and facing the ceiling. I was so happy to be out in space again, and that was the moment or so before I realized the strangeness of being the only person standing in a room full of people. Everybody else was lying down except me. There were at least dozens of people on the floor, not all of them intact. They had an appearance of having been dropped from a great height. 3 or 4 bodies were particularly covered with firemen's coats, feet sticking out. Others sprawled glaringly in the open amidst explosive stains. The splashes and bursts carried a violence like big blood sneezes. A hysterical sense of movement in the stillness. I remember particularly a middle-aged lady in a blood-splattered blouse that had a pattern of the Fabergé egg on it, like a blouse that she might have bought in a museum gift shop, actually. Her eyes, lined with black makeup, stared blankly at the ceiling, and her tan was obviously sprayed on her skin, had a healthy apricot glow, even though the top of her head was missing. Dim oils, dulled guilt. Taking tiny steps, I walked out into the middle of the room, swaying slightly off balance. I could hear my own breath rasping in and out, and there was a strange shallowness in the sound, a nightmare lightness I didn't want to look at, and yet I had to. A small Asian man, pathetic and as tiny, and his tan windbreaker curled in a bellying pool of blood. A guard, his uniform almost most recognizable thing about him. His face was burned so badly, with an arm twisted behind his back and a vicious spray where his leg should have been. But the main thing, the important thing, none of the lying down people was hurt. I made myself look at them, each separately, one by one. Even when I couldn't force myself to look at their faces, I knew my mother's feet, her clothes, her two-tone black and white shoes. And long after I was sure of it, I made myself stand there in the midst, folded deep inside myself like a sick pigeon with his eyes closed. In the gallery beyond, more dead, 3 dead, fat, Argyle vest man, cranky, cankered old lady, a milky duckling of a little girl, a red abrasion on her temple, but otherwise hardly a mark on her. But then there was more. I walked through several galleries littered with equipment, but the bloodstains on the floor, there were no dead at all. And when I walked into the far-seeming gallery where she'd gone, the gallery with the anatomy lesson, eyes closed tightly, wishing hard there were only the same stretches and equipment there. As I walked through, in the oddly screaming silence, the only two observers were the same two puzzled Dutchmen who had stared at my mother and me from the wall. "What are you doing here?" Then something snapped. I don't even remember how it happened. I was just in a different space and running through the rooms that were empty except for the haze of smoke that made each grenier seem insustainable and unreal. Earlier, the galleries had seemed fairly straightforward, a meandering but logical sequence where all tributaries flowed into the gift shop, but coming back through them fast in the opposite direction, I realized that the path wasn't straight at all, and over, I turned into blank walls and veered into dead-end rooms. Doors and entrances weren't where I expected them to be. Freestanding piliers loomed out of nowhere, swinging around the corner a little too sharply. I almost ran headlong into a gang of Franz guardsmen. Big, rough, ruddy-cheeked guys, bleary from too much beer, like New York City cops at a costume party. Coldly, they stared me down with hard, humorous eyes as I recovered, backed off, and began to run again. Even on a good day, I sometimes got turned around in the museum, wandering aimlessly in the galleries of oceanic art, totem dugout canoes. And sometimes I had to go up and ask a guard to point the way out. The painting galleries were especially confusing since they're rearranged so often as I ran around the empty halls. In the ghostly half-light, I was growing more and more frightened. I thought I knew my way to the main staircase, but soon after, as out of the special exhibition gallery, things started to look familiar, and after a minute or two, running lightheaded through turns I was no longer quite sure of, I realized I was thoroughly lost. Somehow I'd gotten right through the Italian masterwork, crucified Christ and astonished saints, serpents and embattled angels, ending up in England, 18th century, a part of the museum I had seldom been in before and did not know at all. Long, elegant lines of sight stretched out before me, maze-like halls which had the feel of a haunted mansion, periwigged lords, cool Gainsborough beauties gazing superciliously down at my distress. The baronial perspectives were infuriating since they didn't seem to lead to the staircase or any of the main corridors, but only to the stately borrowed galleries exactly like them. And I was so close to tears when I suddenly saw an inconspicuous door on the side of the gallery wall. You had to look twice to see it. This door, it was painted the same color as the gallery wall. The kind of door which, in normal circumstances, looked like it would have been kept locked. It had only caught my attention because it wasn't completely closed. The left side wasn't flush with the wall. Whether because it hadn't caught properly or because the lock wasn't working with the electricity out, I didn't know. Still, it was not easy to get open. It was heavy steel, and I had to pull with all my strength. Suddenly, with a pneumatic gasp, it gave so capriciously, I stumbled. Squeezing through, I found myself in a dark hallway under a much lower ceiling. The emergency lights were much weaker than the main gallery, and it took my eyes a moment to adjust. The hallway seemed to stretch on for miles. Fearfully, I crept along, peering into the offices where the doors happened to stand ajar. Cameron Gleiser, registrar. Mike Ferjuda, assistant registrar. Drawers were open and chairs were pushed away from the desk. In the doorway of one office, a woman's high-heeled shoe lay on its side. The pair of abandonment was unspeakably eerie. It seemed that far in the distance I could hear police sirens, maybe even walkie-talkies and dogs, but my ears were ringing so hard from the explosion that I thought I might as well be hearing things. It was starting to unnerve me more and more that I had seen no firemen, no cops, no security guards. In fact, not a single living soul. It wasn't dark enough for the keychain flashlight in the staff-only area, but neither was there nearly enough light for me to see well. I was in some sort of records or storage area. The offices were lined with filing cabinets, floor to ceiling metal shelves with plastic mailroom crates and cardboard boxes. The narrow corridor made me feel edgy, closed in. My footsteps echoed so crazily that once or twice I stopped and turned around to see if somebody was coming down the hall after me. "Hello?" I said tentatively, glancing at some of the rooms as I passed, and some of the offices were modern and sparse. Others were crowded and dirty-looking with untidy stacks of papers and books. Florin Kloner, Department of Musical Instruments. Maurice Oberau-Russell, Islamic Art. Victoria Gibetti, Textiles. I passed a cavernous, dark room with a long workshop table where mismatched scraps of cloth were laid out pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. In the dark of the room was a jumble of rolling garments, racks with lots of plastic garments, bags hanging off them like wrecks by the service elevators at Bendel's or Berdoff's. At the T-junction, I looked this way and that, not knowing where to look, where to turn. I smelled floor wax, turpentine, chemicals, a tang of smoke. Offices and workshops stretched out to infinity in all directions. It contained a geometrical network, fixed and featureless. To my left, light flickered from a ceiling fixture. It hummed and caught in a staticky fit. And in the trembling glow, I saw a drinking fountain down the hall. I ran for it, so fast my feet almost slid out from underneath me and gulped with my mouth pressed against the spigot. So much cold water, so fast that a spike of pain slid into my temple. Hiccuping, I rinsed the blood from my hands and splashed water on my sore eyes. Tiny splinters of glass, almost invisible, tickled to the steel tray of the fountain like needles of ice. I leaned against the wall. Overhead fluorescence vibrating, splitting off and on, made me feel queasy. With effort, I pulled myself up again. On I walked, wobbling a bit in the unstable flicker. Things were looking decidedly more industrial in this direction when platelets, a flatbed, pushcart, a sense of crated objects being moved and stored. I passed another junction where a slick, shadowy passageway receded into darkness, and I was just about to walk past it. I kept going and saw a red glow at the end that said, "Exit." I tripped. I fell over my feet. I got up again, still hiccuping, and ran down the exit. Endless halls. Down at the end of the corridor was a door with a metal bar, like a security door at my school. I pushed it open with a bark. Down a dark stairwell I ran, 12 steps. A turn at the landing, 12 steps to the bottom, my fingertips skimming on the metal rail, shoes clattering and echoing so crazy that it sounded like half a dozen people were running down with me. At the foot of the steps, it was a gray institutional corridor with another barred door. I threw myself against it, pushed it open with both hands, and was slammed hard in the face by rain and the deafening wail of sirens. I think I might have screamed out loud. I was so happy to be outside, though nobody could have heard me in all the noise. I might as well have been trying to scream over the jet engines on the tarmac of LaGuardia during a thunderstorm. It sounded like every fire truck, every cop car, every ambulance and emergency vehicle in 5 boroughs, plus Jersey, was howling and caterwauling out on Fifth Avenue. A deliriously happy noise, like New Year's Eve and Christmas, and the 4th of July fireworks rolled into one. The exit had spat me out in Central Park, through a deserted side door between the loading docks and the parking garage. Footpaths stood empty in the gray-green distance. Treetops plunged white, tossing a foaming in the wind. Beyond, on the rain-swept street, Fifth Avenue was blocked off. Through the downpour where I stood, I could just see a great, bright bombardment of activity, cranes and heavy equipment, cops pushing the crowds back, red lights, yellow and blue lights, flares that beat, whirled, and flashed in quicksilver confusion. I put my elbow up to keep the rain out of my face and took off running through the empty park. Rain drove in my eyes and dripped down my forehead, melting the lights on the avenue into a blur that pulsed in the distance. NYPD FDNY, Park City vans and with windshield wipers going, K9, Rescue Operation Battalion, NYC Hazmat. Black rain slickered, flapped, and billowed in the wind. A band of yellow crime tape was stretched across the exit of the park at the Miners' Gate. Without hesitation, I lifted it up and ducked underneath it and then ran out to the midst of the crowd. In all the welter, nobody noticed me. For a moment or two, I ran uselessly back and forth in the streets, rain peppering my face. Everywhere I looked, images of my own panic dashed past. People chorused and surged around me blindly. Cops, firemen, guys in hard hats, an elderly man cradling a broken elbow, and a woman with a bloody nose being shooed towards 97th Street by a distracted policeman. Never had I seen so many fire trucks in one place. Squad 18, Fighting 44, New York Ladder 7, Rescue 1, 4 truck, Pride of Midtown, pushing through the seas of parked vehicles and black official raincoats. I spotted a Halotza ambulance, Hebrew letter on the back, a little lighted hospital room visible through the open doors. Attendants were bending over a woman, trying to press down on her as she struggled to sit up, a wrinkled hand with red fingernails clawed at the air. I beat on the door with my fist. "You need to get back inside," I yelled. "People are still in there." "There's another bomb," yelled the attendant without looking at me. "We have to evacuate." Before I had time to register this, the gigantic cop swooped down on me like a thunderclap. A thick-headed, bulldogish guy with pumped-up arms like weightlifters. He grabbed me roughly by the upper arms, began to hustle, and shoved me to the other side of the street. "What the fuck are you doing over here?" he bellowed, drowning out my protests as I tried to wrench free. "Sir," a bloody-faced woman coming up, trying to get his attention. "Sir, I think my hand is broken." "Get back from the building," he screamed at her, throwing her arm off and then at me. "Go!" But with both hands, he shoved me so hard I staggered back and nearly fell. "Get back from the building!" he screamed, throwing up his arms with a flap of his rain slicker. "Now!" He wasn't even looking at me. His small, bearish eyes were riveted on something going over my head, up the street, and the expression of his face terrified me. In haste, I dodged through the crowd of emergency workers to the opposite sidewalk, just above 79th Street, keeping an eye out for my mother, although I didn't see her. Ambulances and medical vehicles galore. Beth Israel Emergency, Lenox Hill, New York pedestrian, Cabrini EMS paramedics. A bloody man in a business suit lay flat on his back behind an ornamental yew hedge in the tiny fenced yard of a Fifth Avenue mansion. A yellow security tape was strung up, snapping and popping in the wind, but the rain-drenched cops and firemen guys in hard hats were lifting it up and ducking back and forth under it as if it wasn't even there. All eyes were turned upwards, and only later I would ever learn why. On 84th Street, too far away from me to see, the hazmat cops were in the process of disrupting an undetonated bomb by shooting it with a water cannon, intent on talking to someone and trying to figure out what had happened. I tried to push my way towards the fire truck, but cops were charging through the crowds, waving their arms, clapping their hands, beating people back. I caught hold of a fireman's coat, a young man, a young, gum-chewing, friendly-looking guy. "Someone's still in there!" I screamed. Yeah, we know," shouted the fireman without looking at me. "They ordered us out. They're telling us 5 minutes. They're letting us back in." A swift push in the back. "Move, move," I heard somebody scream, now rough voice, heavily accented. "Get your hands off me. Now, everybody get moving." Somebody else pushed me in the back. A fireman leaned off the ladder trucks, looking upwards towards the Temple of Dender. Cops stood tensely, shoulder to shoulder, impassive in the rain. Stumbling past them, swept along by the current, I saw glazed eyes, heads nodding, feet uncautiously tapping out the countdown. By the time I heard the crack of the disrupted bomb and the hoarse football stadium cheer rising from Fifth Avenue, I had already been swept along towards Madison. Traffic cops were windmilling their arms, pushing the stream of students, people back. "Come on, people, move it, move it." They plowed through the crowd, clapping their hands. "Everybody, east Everybody east. One cop. A big guy with a goatee and an earring like a professional wrestler reached out and shoved a delivery guy in a hoodie who was trying to take a picture on his cell phone so that we stumbled back into me and nearly knocked me over. "Watch it!" screamed the delivery guy in a high, ugly voice, and the cop shoved him again, this time so hard he fell on his back in the gutter. "Are you deaf or what, buddy?" he yelled. "Get going. Don't touch me. How about I bust your head open?" Between 5th and Madison, it was a madhouse. Whap of helicopter rotors overhead, indistinct talking on a bullhorn. Through 79th Street, though 79th Street was closed to traffic. It was packed with cop cars, fire trucks, cement barricades, and throngs of screaming, panicking, dripping wet people. Some of them were running from 5th Avenue. Some were trying to muscle and press their way back towards the museum. Many people held cell phones aloft, attempting to snap pictures. Others stood motionless with their jaws dropped as the crowd surged around them, staring up at the black smoke in the rainy skies over 5th Avenue as if the Martians were coming down. Sirens. White smoke billowing from the subway vents. A homeless man wrapped in dirty blankets wandering back and forth, looking eager and confused. I looked around, hopefully for my mother in the crowd, fully expecting to see her. For a short time, I tried to swim upstream against the cop-driven current, standing on my toes, craning to see, until I realized it was hopeless to push back up and try to look for her in that torrential rain, that mob. "You'll just see her at home," I thought. Home was where we were supposed to meet. Home was the emergency arrangement. She must have realized how useless it would be trying to find me in that crush. But still felt a petty, irrational pang of disappointment, and as I walked home, skull-cracking, headache practically seeing double, I kept looking for her, scanning anonymously preoccupied faces around me. She'd gotten out. That was the important thing. She'd been rooms away from the worst part of the explosion. None of the bodies was hers, and no matter what we had agreed upon beforehand, no matter how much sense it made, somehow I still couldn't quite believe that she walked away from the museum without me. Okay, I'll be getting into chapter 2, the anatomy lesson, next time on the Reading Rainstorm.